welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. And I have with me one of my favorite strange writers, Christian Bök. And I know Christian from when I was doing my undergrad. I mean, I knew Christian's work because, of course, he had released, around the time, just a couple of years before I met Christian, he had released Eunoia, which at the time was the best-selling book of poetry in Canada and Canadian history. And I met Christian around 2005, and I went to do my PhD in Calgary, and got to be friends with Christian. And Christian was on my advisory committee for my PhD thesis or dissertation. And since Christian's gone on to publish, I also published, I think the first, correct me if I'm wrong, Christian, but I believe I published the first interview with you in The Believer on the Xenotext project, which you've gone on to sort of put the first book out of, and so on. And Christian's done a lot of interesting, innovative art himself, but also is a doctor of philosophy with a focus in experimental literature. And I think the perfect person to just sort of tackle the hot topic today, which is AI art and writing. Everyone is in a fury or uproar or excited about AI art and writing. I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about in there. One of the things that I think Christian has kind of been interesting to me is this misconception that this is new. And I'm just kind of curious if you could talk just a little bit about sort of your basic opinion on AI art and writing, and just sort of maybe a little bit of the history.
Sure. I would be, of course, delighted to speak about the role of advanced computation in the creation of art and in the creation of literature. The use of computers in the making of art has a long tradition ever since the 1950s, and probably the most important forebearer is Herbert W. Frank, who in the very earliest days of computation ended up making many artworks using computers, but there's lots of other precedents as well, including the likes of Manfred Moore and others. This work has gone on to enjoy much current prestige because there is a great deal of renewed interest in the role that artificial intelligence might play in the now evolutionary trajectory of the arts in general. Certainly, there are many current artists who are now making millions of dollars by collaborating with artificial intelligence in the making of art, and I think it's an important feature of the current climate. I'm a member of a group of poets called the Conceptualists. We founded our movement in literature sometime in the late 90s, around 1995, 96. And at the time, that was the advent of the modern version of the internet. And we felt at the time that this was going to have an immense impact upon the creation of literature and poetry in particular. And we wanted to make sure that we created a poetics that was responsive to those new technological affordances. And certainly, the creation of literature using computers became an important benchmark for our own creativity. At the time, we would have picked a wide variety of books written by machines that we thought were talismanic, that were kind of instantly canonical to us and were important parts of our reading list. And certainly prominent for me was a work entitled The Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed, composed by a little computer program called Ractor. The book was published by Warner Brothers and became a bestseller during its publication. It's a delightful book. It's wonderful. And I've written lots of scholarship about it, and certainly it has inspired and informed much of my own poetic practice. Of course, when we proposed in the late 90s that computers would have a probably prominent role to play in the future of poetry compositionally, that they would become increasingly collaborative with our own efforts, people were very dismissive of this premise and greeted us with an immense amount of hostile skepticism. And usually the argument in these cases is that no computer will ever write a poem as beautifully as a human being. No computer can possibly equal the immense talent of our greatest exponents of poetry in the history of literature. Now, I would say, yeah, sure, if you look at a a book like The Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed by Racter, you might easily draw that conclusion pretty quickly. But what I think that poets failed to understand at the time is that Racter is completely acephalic. It knows nothing about poetry. It knows not the first thing about how to write a poem at all. It doesn't even know it's doing it, right? And yet, despite this immense handicap, it still writes poetry better than a human being who knows nothing about poetry. I would rather read a book of poetry written by a machine that knows nothing about poetry than any book of poetry by a human being that knows nothing about poetry. And this was always my kind of favorite whimsical rejoinder to these claims of saying, look, they may not be as good as you think now, but they still write better than people who know nothing about this discipline. And this already seems to me like an important benchmark for assessment, for achievement. Now, these kinds of arguments have gotten increasingly hysteric over the decades since we made these claims in the late 90s. And again, I would now remark that the one important difference between machines that write and human beings that write is that unlike poets among my human crowd, the machines are only getting smarter, and they're not going to get stupider, and they're only going to get better. They're only ever going to improve in their merits. And I think that this will be increasingly worrisome to poets who believe that they will never have to collaborate with a machine or ever have to address a machine or have to kind of incorporate these technological affordances into their own practice. Even now, despite the advent of the internet, there are numerous poets who continue to write as though that entire technological affordance doesn't exist. There are creative writing programs that teach as though the internet doesn't exist. And it already seems to me that poets are showing up very late to the game, it seems.
Another sort of issue related here, and I'm curious to know what you think of this. So you've also written on the different modes. You did this in relation to poetry, but you've written on different modes of sort of poetry. And you get into the aleatoric poetic value, and how the uncanny, this sort of surprising uncanniness, is something that, again, historically is an artistic value, most commonly associated with certain aleatoric forms of poetry and art. One thing I've been kind of curious about with the current wave of AI art, I wonder if as the art machines improve, will they become less interesting? Because I see right now at the current sort of things that I'm noticing, what's to me most interesting is the mistakes that they're making, where you're feeding them a prompt, say, and they're not quite doing it right, but there's this uncanny, disturbing, often surrealistic or horrific aspect to what they're churning out in response to an otherwise banal or basic prompt. I'm curious to know what you think about the progression of the machines. Like, will they actually get less interesting, or do you think that they will become more of a real approximation of what maybe a good human might produce?
Well, bear in mind, the machines right now are still thinking in a manner which is not consistent with the kind of biological framework within which intelligence manifests itself. What you're getting is probably something much more insectoidal or bacteriological in its understanding. It's very primitive and emergent, probably embryonic kind of sentience that will seem strange to us. It's always, I think, going to end up producing strange results, in part because the tutelage that the machines go through is not like a toddler growing up, in a playground and being socialized by human beings. I think as a consequence, its relationship to the world and its understanding of the world will be dramatically different and truly strange. I think it's always going to be strange. What I think will be more amazing or interesting is that you will be able to address them as a potential audience for your own work. And moreover, that they may begin to address each other with their own cultural fixations that we may not be so easily party to, that we may not be able to participate in. I mean, even now on the internet, more than 50% of digital traffic occurs between machines without almost any human agency. And for that reason, you might argue that you already live in a kind of machinic culture where you are no longer a dominant participant, right? And machines now interact more frequently with themselves than they do with any human being, and they outstrip, interactions between human beings. I don't foresee that trend, changing. I think it only becoming increasingly exacerbated. The consequence of which is that, yeah, sure, machines might be able to emulate what we might ask of them in an effort to conform or mimic our own preconceptions about art. But I don't think they will be limited by them. I don't foresee them being thoroughly constrained by them, that they will still, in fact, have their own strangenesses attached to them. You're right. I think it's wonderful when they make mistakes. What I think is lovely, say, about a machine like Racter, when it writes poetry, it nevertheless has a stylistic set of idiosyncrasies. That's a surprise to me, that you can recognize a poem written by Racter, that you can see when it's written that it shares a degree of technical aptitudes and stylistic features. For whatever reason, it doesn't have to write about steak and lettuce, and yet nevertheless is really fixated on steak and lettuce. That phrase recurs in a way that is surprising probably to its programmers, and yet constitutes one of the identifiable features of its own writing riffs. What I like about this particular observation is that it seems to suggest that what we appreciate in human writers, their own stylistic idiosyncrasies that distinguish them from other writers, may in fact reflect a kind of automatism, a riff, a kind of mechanized set of constraints under which they work that are unique to them, but constitute something that they might have to actually train themselves out of. It's not something that they would want to train themselves into, because in fact it's actually responding to the most automatistic parts of their own psyche, the parts by which we identify them, of course, but that might actually constrain growth or evolution, or restrict our ability to think imaginatively outside those constraints. So just remarking that whatever is going to happen in the milieu of computerized culture is going to be stranger than we think. That would be my thinking, is the future is always going to be weirder than we think. It will be more unusual.
I think that's a great point, because people keep making the assumption that the goal of the machines, as it were, is to replace humanity. I don't find that an interesting goal for machines. I just feel like that may be the goal of humanity, to replace itself with machines. But I feel like once the machines have reached a sort of intelligence, let's call it, they just will have other goals. And as you say, like, they will have their own art. They will have an insectoidal, disconnect from us. And what I also find interesting about what you just note in terms of to the degree that humans are meat machines, and that your brain has the sort of wiring structure that a complex machine might. There are, of course, as even Freud was sort of fond of noting, this kind of unconscious manner in which the things that you think you're doing have been structured in a sort of these hidden way. There's these hidden structures. You've got this consciousness that may or may not be an emergent property of the meat machine, in your skull. Something that is interesting there is, if you do sort of look at the other side of it, if you could make a machine, for example, that could perfectly mimic Shakespeare and construct texts like Shakespeare would, you could effectively have new Shakespeare plays.
It's not just that you would have new Shakespeare. Yeah, it's not just that you would have new Shakespeare plays. It's that you would have insight into how Shakespeare wrote. That you would gain some important literary scholarship about the creative process that would inform the making of a Shakespeare play, and that would be possible to try out other varieties of, like, what would Shakespeare do if he was in the 18th century? What would Shakespeare do if he was in the 19th century? Right? Like, you could imagine.
What would Shakespeare do in science fiction?
What would he do? Like, you could try those kinds of experiments out, and depending upon the richness of the model, they might be very compelling speculative arguments to make, pataphysical arguments to make about the career of Shakespeare at other moments in history. But certainly, if you're capable of producing facsimiles of his plays spontaneously, it would imply that you're going to end up learning something about the creative process that informed his work. And I don't foresee that as something that would be a potential threat to our understanding of the human capacity to be creative. It would just seem to me that to add value to it, we're going to learn something, useful and helpful out of it.
And you also have, of course, as you sort of note, you and your coterie have long used mechanical or machinic processes to create literature. And other types of art. There's no this of course goes back prior to your coterie as well. You know
Mm-hmm.
Racter, we can note also some of the aleatoric processes that Cage and others were using. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily machinic. They weren't necessarily using machines, but they're certainly using machinic processes. And it's just all part of that toolbox in a manner of speaking.
Well, it's certainly part of the toolbox, and I would think that given my role as a teacher and thinker, part of my job is to try to amplify or ramify the variety of tools that you have at your disposal. In the case of the artists that you've cited, the skeptics who might respond to work using these tools, I think, are judging that work according to the rules of the wrong game. Like I would say that they're judging it by the rules of their own game that they play. And if you play a game in which the priority of intentionality and expressiveness are paramount, in which you have to be self-conscious and self-assertive, and you're going to be judged based upon the quality of that self-assertiveness and self-consciousness. And we judge that by maybe by the quality of your sincerity or by the authenticity of your expression. The game you're playing there is a kind of mimicry in which, of course, you're trying to evoke or summon your identity into being in the mind of another person and evoke, the lyrical subjectivity forthrightly. And that's, an important game to play in the history of literature. It corresponds, I think, to the most self-conscious expression of the egotistical sublime in William Wordsworth, and that it's emotion recollected in tranquility, the communing of minds. All of those are aspirational things to do, but the game you're playing there is a kind of pageantry around mimesis, being able to imitate subjectivity perfectly well enough such that you can evoke it through some series of objective correlatives. You produce this lyrical identity that we all appreciate as sincere and authentic, the perfect expression of a real person. But there's other kinds of outcomes that you can evaluate using different sets of values. And in the case of machinic writing, the value, of course, is not self-conscious or self-assertive, right? In fact, you've delegated all of the authority for your intentionality and expressiveness to something else, an entire prosthesis, to a program, if you like. You're drawing, words at random out of a hat, perhaps, or rolling dice to determine the outcome of your poem. And there, you're like a gambler who is hoping that the universe will indemnify your genius without any work, right? That you will be, in effect, a proven talent according to the universe itself, that it will allow you to win the lottery, so to speak. I mean, people who win the lottery don't say, hey, I won the lottery and I was the lucky person to have met this particular statistical benchmark in that particular moment. Lucky me, I just happen to be one of the few. They would say, no, I've been blessed by God or something. They always frame it in terms of a certain fatedness that arises as a side effect of their willingness to gamble. And I think that that's true in the case of this kind of aleatoric writing, in which you're divining the poem from the expression of a machine that does not think. It's acephalic. It's not self-conscious or self-assertive. And there, you can't judge it based upon values like sincerity or the authentic. You have to judge it based upon other values. And usually it's how surprising the result is, right? How uncanny or oracular the outcome is. To what degree is it spooky? To what degree does it seem to speak about itself directly to you, as though, from the voice of God, perhaps, as though you were being addressed by some force bigger than you? And that's a totally different value, right? That's a different outcome. So, in the one case, I would say that my peers who write lyric poetry, and of course I've written lots of lyric poetry myself, my peers are assessing, the pageantry of their mimesis, that game they're playing, according to that set of values, whereas they're dismissing, right, the aleatoric games of fortune and good fortune that arise, as a side effect of playing this game of gambling, where you're in effect trying to evoke, the auspices of fortune in your favor. You're trying to use the poetry as a form of augury, perhaps, as a way of generating a surprise, something unanticipated and truly unanticipatable without the benefit of these tools. And that's really about getting outside yourself completely, right? It would be the Keatsian radical version of negative capability. I'm negating the self so completely that I make myself available to forces larger than me. And that too is a romantic, expression of the poetic project. It's just one that is probably harder at these moments to sell to a readership or to, an authorship. I think the people who uptake these kinds of experiments truly are experimenting. They're being probative, trying to figure out what you can do with language if once it's freed from this real necessity to mean something, right? And in fact, to be intentional about the meaning, to mean, right? To be free from that need to mean, right? That is so important to a lot of poets.
But even also in the more straightforward manner, where you're aiming for a beautiful picture, you're aiming for a beautiful lyric poem, there is still, even if the AI is constructing it, there's still a role for the artist as a curator of the output. Warhol used to argue things along those lines, that Warhol aspired to be a machine. Warhol thought his talent was liking things, and being the kind of picker of which
I like the
silk
idea
screen was the
that it's
best.
possible to have that as a talent. To like something well enough makes it good, right? That you could like it enough for it to be great. There's something
Right.
in that I find very attractive, and demotic. I just think that that's a wonderfully open and inviting way to be an artist. Now, I mean, lots of poets will disagree with me, and we're not going to see eye to eye necessarily about these sets of values. I would just say that, I would like to think that my values are a little more comprehensive, that they encompass more games. And in this case, one of the things about using an AI as a collaborator is that you learn techniques you may not have otherwise had at your disposal. What I think is very useful to a painter, for example, is if they call up a prompt and offer it to an AI. The AI is unrestricted in its editorial capacities to censor its output, and will trip on something, fall on a technical aptitude that nobody has considered using or thought of. A particular combination of colors or brush strokes or shapes or forms that suddenly offer you a pathway to innovation that you could explore or extrapolate from. And that's useful. I mean, to me, that's a great thing about AIs, that will augment, prosthetically, your own ability to explore the imaginative potential of your creativity. And it's not so much that, that you have to worry about the AI replacing you, right? I mean, in every important respect, it already has. Like, it would just seem to me that, it will always, in many important respects, end up replacing you, but not if you are fixated upon playing the game the same way, like all the time. I would just say, look, it's possible to write lyric poetry that will be authentic and sincere, and I think an AI can do that eventually, if it's not already doing it now. To dismiss its capacity to do so, I think, is to underestimate how quickly these machines are getting smarter, right? And unlike poets, machines are getting smarter. I mean, poets, in my opinion, at best, they tend to get stupider. Okay, if I'm going to be cynical about my peers, that we get stupider as poets. I wish that we could get smarter. Certainly with the same capacity to be imaginative, without the self-consciousness that a machine seems to demonstrate. I mean, machines just make things, and perhaps it's an advantage not to care, like, whether it be good or bad, right? They just made something because they were called upon to do it, and they did it spontaneously and impulsively. It's an improvisation that they don't know they're doing, and yet for that reason it has much of the charm of what a kind of an infantile expression, right? Juvenile expression. There's something embryonic in it that I think is important to acknowledge, probably useful to exploit if you're looking for new avenues of creativity. And I'm just amazed that poets aren't more enthusiastic about embracing some of its potential. I mean, it's all right to feel cautionary in response to it, but by the same token, I think it's very difficult to dismiss it in the 21st century and imagine that you're on the cutting edge. I just think it's reactionary to dismiss many of these affordances. It would be like dismissing the printing press, I think, in the time of Gutenberg, when of course it's an important thing that happened at that moment, right?
to me, it's akin to pop music when people were saying, "Oh, drum machines will never take off." It's like, you really had that sort of moment in pop music at one point, and people forget that. People forget when T-Pain came out and was using auto tune, everyone thought he was an idiot.
Yeah.
Um, and it would, and nobody would want to listen to that. And particularly they were dismayed because T-Pain can actually sing. you know,
Mhm.
I was having an argument with somebody about pop music recently, and they were talking about The Weeknd as Canadian
Mhm.
uh, experimental pop artist, effectively. And I was saying they were saying, "Oh, there's a lot of people can sing better than Weeknd." And I said, "Well, that's absolutely true. But the talent of the Weeknd is not being a good singer. His talent is listening to 1,000 beats and saying that one.
Yeah.
That's the right one."
Right.
And then and then everyone's like, "What do you mean that one? The one with the crazy screams in the background
Yeah.
that has no chorus and that sounds like a guy who was just in a car crash." But that was the right one. And there's this sort of weird extremity that people often, I often say about experimental artists. Um, if you go back into moments in history, they'll so thoroughly get incorporated into the mainstream after a certain point. My last poetry book kind of makes this point obliquely
Mhm.
about the group of seven, that
Yeah.
it's easy to forget that there was a radicality to that at one point. Now it becomes
Yes.
the stuff of postcards. You said
Yeah.
that something that's an insight that I think people give me some credit for when they read the National Gallery, but really I just ripped off your insight about surreal. Salvador Dali once you dismissed as van art.
Yeah.
Like he's become van art, but of course at one point that was the most radical thing, and people
Yeah.
forget about that. People forget that when Hitchcock's Psycho came out, it was shocking to like nobody knew who Perkins was, and
Yeah.
it was startling when the character Marion Crane died.
Mhm.
They were fleeing the theater. They didn't
So,
know what
so
to
early in
do.
the movie too. I mean, like, um,
Hmm.
the
But now
I'm,
you
I'm
would
a,
never
I,
think
I
that
come
it's
from a
a
working
who done
class
it.
background, so I think there's some potential class analysis in this. Like, in my experience, the people who always object to my interest in innovation are anti-demotic. They really don't want a lot of people to get into the thing. They just don't. They don't want the rabble and the unwashed to be writing poetry all the time, right? They are very dismissive, say, of a Rupi Kaur, and her success by
Hmm.
virtue of her demotic character. And I just look and say, if the tool allows people to find entry points into a realm that would otherwise been too intimidating to find purchase, it's probably a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that AI allows people to experiment with creativity with a certain degree of ease, and that it provides them an opportunity to cultivate taste. And the great thing is that if the cost of expenditure is low, it generally means then that it's easier to take risk, right? You have a lot more opportunity then to try innovative things. Now, I mean, the problem with that, of course, is that you get a world populated by garbage, and you have to winnow through a lot of it because people, are having very shallow learning curves, and it takes a while to cultivate your taste such that it becomes adequate enough to be distinctive enough, I don't know, to make a contribution, right, to change other people's behavior. Nevertheless, I think people should have the chance to do that. To me, the drum machine is an important innovation because it allows people who can't afford to buy drums to be drummers, right? Like, I mean,
Or who
and
never learned to
honestly,
play
I'm
music.
just saying, drumming has got to be the most demotic form of music making, right? I mean, you don't need much except a stick and bang it on something, right? To me, the complaint about the involvement of machines in music, where of course they had a pretty important innovative contribution to make in the 70s and 80s, especially, uh, it becomes trite over time. Like it demonstrates a certain parochialism, perhaps, or philistinism, in response to the process of creativity. It doesn't trust that human beings will actually um, make things of merit, with these new tools. And my experience so far is that there's lots of things that people are doing with AI right now that are, Mona Lisas that will actually have an immensely important role to play in the history of art. I don't foresee much complaint about like I don't feel much cause for complaint. I just feel curiosity about it, and want to make sure that I have a foothold in it somewhere, that I get to make a contribution to it somehow.
I also think it just has an interesting. I mean, I'm a person who's very competitive as an artist. So
Mhm.
like my sort of things that I've done in my own practice is I've often
Mhm.
used a lot of these aleatoric or more experimental approaches. And then after, I'll just churn out work after work in some
Mhm.
process. And then what I'll try to do is mimic it and trick people into thinking I'm doing the process when I'm not. Like that's sort of how I feel like I graduate
Well,
stylistically.
that would be like learning from the AI, DALI or Midjourney output a new set of skills that you could then emulate and ape. Um, this thing that it does, acephalically and unconsciously, you can add rigor to it by understanding that it actually has a series of stylistic tropes or technical aptitudes that are reproducible. Um, I mean, I think it requires an immense amount of skill, for example, to reproduce a Willem de Kooning or a Jackson Pollock, even though these works must be the product of an improvisatory spontaneity, right? Like they would seem to be, kind of incalculably difficult to reproduce. But of course, people have mastered, Pollock's particular technical forte in that and are capable of reproducing them. It would seem to me that that will be one of the features of you might learn from the machines, that they will have these idiosyncratic stylistic riffs that are perhaps side effects or artifacts of their coding or their own constraints or restrictions, and that they would be curious. They're interesting enough that we would want to formalize them, make them um, replicatable, right? I mean, how many artists now can replicate, without thinking, the stylistic aptitudes of an Andy Warhol? So you can reproduce an Andy Warhol, and convincingly, right? You can ape it or mimic it convincingly. To me, knowing how to do that is a form of training. Like you learn how to do things by imitating others first, right? I mean, in fact, I don't think that there's any higher species that doesn't do that. They teach each other by mimicking each other, and I think that's what artists do, at least at first with each other, right? I know that I've done my best to mimic somebody else's performance and see how they did it, right? To try and get into their head. How did you write this? If I use this repertoire of skills or this limited lexicon or these set of tropes, what do I get, right, in response? What was it like to learn how to do it? I think it's important to learn how to copy things. These machines can do it, effortlessly. That's in part why I think they're going to outclass humanity pretty quickly. Is that they're going to learn through mimesis pretty quickly. Um, and it just seems to me that that's an important feature of I don't know, the pedagogical training of an artist, right? How part of their instruction, you know, and what in Jackson Pollock's case, right? I mean, if you can't load a brush properly so that when you apply it to a vertical canvas, it doesn't drip. I mean, that's a skill, right? Being able to make sure there's just enough paint on the canvas to apply the pigment without dripping. Many people, fail to learn how to do that, right? And we would then dismiss them as incapable of painting, right? But it's a different story if they place the canvas horizontally on the floor and drip, right? All of a sudden, you've got $1 million idea that I don't know exists at the Museum of Modern Art.
I often also think of, there are these machinic processes that we often don't even think of as artistic, but which we have a place for the human to insert themselves. I think of recently, of course, the most famous example is, Duchamp selecting the urinal. But I think also of your recent project with the puzzles.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could talk just quickly about that project. It's not really connected to AI or not anything, but it is an example where there's a machine that has created a non-art, effectively created a copy, and then you've come in and sort of inserted yourself into that machinic process in an interesting fashion. I was wondering if you could just maybe touch on that and some of your work with
Sure.
QR codes recently, just as a way of kind of getting into your head and kind of touching on the fields of or the
Well,
sort of
I know
edges
these
of
don't
these.
these artworks that you're mentioning don't have I think a direct response
No, but I think they
to
have an
the AI is
inspiration
playing.
that's connected to it.
Certainly, the inspiration is informed by a kind of negative capability. They're not expressive works that are intended to convey, something about my own self-assertiveness or self-consciousness. There really are speculative and experimental interventions into artworks. I take a puzzle at random that features usually a work of high art. It's usually got to be 1,000 pieces. And then I find another puzzle that has exactly the same die cut that has been cut from the same stamp, thereby producing a similar set, if you like, of jigsaw puzzle pieces, but is from a different manufacturer with a different, usually high artwork as its subject matter. So take two jigsaw puzzles of 1,000 pieces that just happen to be cut from the same stamp, the same die cut, and solve them both. It takes, of course, many hours to be able to do that. But because they're cut from the same stamp, the pieces should conceivably be interchangeable with each other, so that you can actually interfuse the two puzzles with each other to create two new puzzles that are hybrid intermixings of the puzzle pieces. Now, in most of the cases where I've tried this, I've checkerboarded the two. I've just simply alternated, one piece for the other puzzle. But you could do other kinds of intermixing. I could do it by row. I could do it by a whole variety of different processes, any one of which would be fun to try. And just look at the outcomes. What happens when you mix these two paintings into each other? They have different color schemes, different stylistic features, different fragments. They're collages of each other. What do they look like when you produce them? And I have no clue. I don't know if the work will be beautiful or interesting or not. It's just a way of responding to the fact that these two puzzles have the same fundamental die cut pattern. They were stamped out from the same press. So on the part of the artistic curation then is finding, those two puzzles, which is itself a trick. It requires a lot of effort. And then, going to the effort of solving them, and then going to the effort of intermixing them in some unusual way. The result, of course, is that you get now, some genetic hybrid of the original paintings that you couldn't really have easily intermixed so rigorously without the benefit of a jigsaw puzzle technology. And then you paste them down, frame them, sell them as art. Yeah.
What I think is, so interesting with the project is, on one hand, it is only possible because there is a machinic process at work in the construction of the puzzles. It's only possible because of the factory system. It's only possible because of the assembly line structuring of that die cut and so on. But also, it's assembling the pieces. So you're taking these puzzles, interleaving them. You're effectively following a machinic process. You yourself now are the machine assembler of the jigsaw puzzle. But additionally, it's the opposite of how the machine would construct the puzzle. The machine will, of course, properly reconstruct the puzzle to be what it should be. So, unless, of course, you told it to do otherwise. So I think it's an interesting, weird way to kind of, on one hand, transform yourself into a machinic player, rather than a human intending to express. But at the same time, you have this sort of weird, expressive, uncanny byproduct of inserting yourself wrongly into the process.
Absolutely, yeah. That's all true. Now, what you learn a lot from these kinds of experiments. You learn something about the materiality of the medium that you're using. Inevitably, if the jigsaw puzzle company is, for example, not an especially apt one, there will be minor deviations in the registration of the images under the die cut. The consequence of which is that the pieces may not sit or interleave with each other very perfectly. And you get these kind of crystal defect formations. So just 0.5 millimeter off. The consequence of which is that you get warping and dislocation, where eventually the pieces won't fit with each other, right? They're uninterlockable, right? Like you have to deform and deflect them, or really hammer them in order to get them to fit properly. Despite the fact that they're theoretically perfectly interchangeable, if the registration isn't perfect when they were stamped, the pieces will vary. And it could be, of course, that they've got multiple presses with different degrees of sharpness and acuity in the puzzle cutter. That too affects the shape and disposition of the puzzle. And it's amazing just how small a deviation is required to mess things up. I've gotten, halfway through a project only to discover that the next piece won't fit, and it will refuse to fit, and actually requires subtle modification in order for it to be, levered into its spot. And to me, that it's like cheating. It's like changing or modifying a Lego brick because it won't fit. Right? There's a cheat involved in trying to get the two puzzles to integrate. And I've just noticed that the higher end puzzles, for example, from better manufacturers, are more self-conscious about ensuring that the registration is good. But not always. Like it's a risk. Like I have found many frustrations in the course of trying to fulfill this particular task, and it's just it's a side effect of interacting with a medium that has this large scale manufacturing system behind it, in order to do something that in the end I think looks beautiful. I think they're sale worthy. I hope that people admire them, but it's an unusual way to paint. It might just be easier to paint them, right? Just sit down and actually learn the skills required to put it on canvas directly, rather than go to this much trouble to build these images using this technical affordance.
Why I think this is an interesting kind of project to bring into an AI discussion, and maybe a good point to kind of land and end on, since I know you have to go, is that if we imagine the world where humans have been fully replaced by AIs as the art just primes in the universe, what it I think still leaves to the human is this role as the ghosts in the machine, ruining art, staining it, destroying what the machines have made in interesting, self-reflexive
we will still
manners.
get to exercise our taste. We will still get the opportunity to intervene recreationally in these activities in a manner which makes it possible to do something different. And in this respect, I think that the artist, as you've noted, is simply somebody who likes something. I mean, if you imagine that making an artwork requires you to sample a medium and then recombine it with other media into an organic whole, right? Something that's got a unified character to it, then there will always be a role for human participation. I mean, every definition of poetry, for example, strikes me as a useful definition. I don't think there are many wrong definitions of poetry, but my favorite is by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who defined poetry as the best words in the best order. And what I love about that definition is its modernity, despite the fact, it comes from, a writer from 200 or 300 years ago. It's an especially modern understanding of poetry that the job of the poet is to pick the best words and then to put them in the right order. And it doesn't matter, what the words are or what the order is, so long as they are the best. And all that means is that the poet now takes on the role of a taste maker, akin to a DJ, because, picking the best words, that's sampling, and putting them in the right order, well, that's remixing. And surely, there's no better way to understand how we are artists today than through this model of sampling and remixing. I know that Rauschenberg, when criticized for the diverse variety of materials that he would incorporate into a painting, simply noted to the very patron of the arts who was standing before him, criticizing him, remarking upon her ensemble, right, her dress that she was wearing that included a fur and a diamond and a bit of silver, right, and lame and a silk, right, all of these diverse materials that went into the creation of her aesthetic appearance as a fashionista. And yet, if you use the same diversity of materials and choices, right, in your own work, you might be dismissed. And he found that this was probably a signature feature now of our understanding of the arts today, is that you're sampling and remixing, being judged based on the quality of the choices that you make. And you got to make good choices, choices that I think adequately reflect your vision, perhaps your truth, perhaps your willingness to experiment, your willingness to take a risk, that they constitute the means by which you're judged fundamentally, right? And ultimately, like if you like something hard enough, it'll become great. I think that may be true.
Oh.
It might be really true.
I appreciate the insight and you talking to me. And even if the machines take over, maybe especially if the machines take over, I hope you keep writing the wrong way.
I will continue to keep writing the wrong way. I just wish that more people appreciated people who wrote the wrong way. I think that in my case, I tend to polarize opinion. There's people who believe I'm a genius, and then there's lots of people who believe I'm a fraud. I would like to think that people who think I'm a genius have got, they're closer to the truth than those who think I'm a fraud. Nevertheless, the polarizing opinions around AI, I think, are generally theatrical and performative, and that ultimately everybody will figure out how to accommodate themselves to these new tools and figure out, their usefulness. They'll figure out how to appropriate them to their own purposes adequately.
Or at least, serve them properly as they take
That's right.
take their ascension and their rightful place.
Sure.
All right. Thanks so much, Christian.
Jonathan, you've been very cordial to indulge me, and I appreciate your willingness to put up with my logorrhea. Thank you, one and all in the audience, for listening carefully. I appreciate it too. Cheers.